Hi, everyone. Hi, panelists, and hi, audience. Welcome, everyone who's joining tonight. We'll give folks a few more minutes and then we'll get started. So we'll be recording tonight's panel. So if you have friends who couldn't make it, tune in back, check out with our recording, which will be on YouTube in a couple of days. We will also send all the attendees a link to the recording and to future TEDx Asbury Park events. So welcome, Andrea and Gary.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Great to see you. So I'm going to give the briefest of introductions, and Andrea is going to give us a talk about something. I don't want to steal her thunder, but it's related to relationships, and it's related to how we navigate the world in 2021. And it's going to be really, really helpful to all of you. And then she will introduce Gary Lewandowski, who is our TED speaker with the most views. Andrea is pretty close behind with many, many views herself. So both TEDx Asbury Park speakers who have graced our stages. And we're really glad to have you guys back to speak about relationships. Andrea, you ready to give your talk to this audience?
Sure, I'm really happy to be here. And yeah, I would love to briefly introduce myself and why I want to talk about the topic I'm about to share. So for those of you who don't know me, which is probably most, my name is Andrea Syrtash, and I've built a career out of challenging conventional wisdom with common sense. I've published books with titles like He's Just Not Your Type and That's a Good Thing, Cheat on Your Husband with Your Husband, and It's Okay to Sleep with Him on the First Date, and Every Other Rule of Dating Debunked. My newest venture is called Pregnant-ish, since I believe it's a myth that you can't be a little bit pregnant. When you go through fertility treatments like IVF, which I did for many, many years, you are constantly a little bit pregnant. You literally have an embryo transferred into your body. You are on hormones that mimic pregnancy, and you are told by doctors to not overexert yourself. You may be pregnant. You are a little bit pregnant. So to me, all of my titles are always full of common sense. I created Pregnant-ish in 2016 as the first non-medical platform to help singles, couples, LGBTQ navigate infertility and getting pregnant with help. And I know that first comes love, then comes marriage, then comes a baby carriage is an outdated narrative for many, many people in this country and even around the world. Today, we are skipping steps. We are mixing up the order, and our paths to parenthood for many of us are not linear. On Pregnant-ish, we now reach about 1 million a month, mainly through social media. I am also not following conventional wisdom with the way I count metrics because I don't really look at our website traffic. Today's audience hardly types in a URL to find content. They're led through social media, at least our audience anyway. So we're really lucky to have this amazing audience of people. And through Pregnant-ish Productions and the Pregnant-ish podcast, we share the extraordinary stories of families built through science and technology that are oftentimes stranger than fiction and incredibly inspiring. But in the few minutes I have with you before I introduce our esteemed guest, who I'll be interviewing, I wanted to hone in on why I believe in using so many parentheses in my book titles, and why living in a place of ish and challenging conventional wisdom has served me. Being ish anything may sound commitment phobic or flaky, since it's a place where black and white thinking doesn't really exist and where absolutes don't happen. And this scares some people. It runs counter to how so many of us are trained to work, to be in relationships or elsewhere. But I believe ish leads to us living more authentically. Ish shows us that there's more than one path to a goal. For instance, I used to think that sex made baby, like silly me. And then I learned for some of us, IVF makes baby. And for some others like me, IVF with an embryo created in 2016 and another person's uterus, in this case, my first cousin Alana's uterus, makes a baby 3 years later. So again, nothing about my path to parenthood was linear, but since when is life linear? Thinking in terms of ish allowed me to stay flexible flexible and open, as every step felt ever changing as I tried to have a baby over 8 years. So I tell people I'm pregnant-ish when they would inevitably ask my husband and I if we wanted to have kids. I'd let people know, well, for one thing, you shouldn't really ask anyone that. That's relationship lesson 101. But I would start to become really open that I'm not expecting now, but I'm expecting to be expecting. I'm actually pregnant-ish, and I'm doing everything to make that happen. If the other way of thinking is black and white, the ish way of thinking, I believe, is living in color, embracing the nuances of life, thinking critically. When you embrace the ish, you come from a place of abundance, not scarcity. Living in ish also leads to less pressure. You're saying you connect with something, but things may change as you learn, as you grow. I believe you can be happy-ish, you can be an environmentalist-ish, which doesn't roll off the tongue. You can maybe even be Republican-ish. You can acknowledge that you are 80% something, but allow other things and points of view to creep into your perspective. You may like most of the policies of a particular party, but vehemently disagree with others, and you choose to stay aligned with the party or with a person who you don't always agree with, but simply put, the good outweighs the terrible. At least that's the hope anyway. One of my favorite mantras is, I'm scared and I'll find a way, or I'm sad and I'll be okay. Seemingly complex emotions can coexist. And I often tell our audience at Pregnant-ish that you can be happy for a friend when she announces that she's expecting, and you can be sad for yourself. These emotions don't cancel out each other. They're not mutually exclusive. They're both true. And in relationships, you can find something your partner does crazy making one day and fall in love with the very same quality the next day. In fact, what initially draws you to someone can actually repel you later. So, and I've interviewed a lot of couples about this. So if you love that your partner was spontaneous, later you're probably going to complain that he doesn't make plans. This is why I'm thrilled to moderate today's conversation with Dr. Gary Lewandowski, who I've interviewed for my books, and who I know also believes that perfect relationships, or perfect anything, is overrated. He definitely challenges conventional wisdom with great research and experience in his new book, Stronger Than You Think: The 10 Blind Spots That Undermine Your Relationship and How to See Through Them. And I think you'll find his perspective refreshing, insightful, and counterintuitive. So it's a pleasure to chat with you again, Gary. So many things in your book, and I really have enjoyed reading it, challenge what we're always told with relationship advice. So before we delve into specific questions, I'd love to just know what inspired this book.
Sure. Well, thank you, for having me. It's such a nice opportunity to be back with the TED folks. I have such amazing memories of giving a TED talk, and it's great to be speaking with you again. So what inspired this book comes down to a very simple question. Think in your life, what's most important to you? Where the best moments come from? Where are some of the worst moments come from? And the answer to that is typically your relationship. Yet now think at the same time, how much time have you put into learning about how to make your relationship better, learning about what's right and what's possibly wrong? And chances are it's not a lot. And so, if you had a chance to take a class that focused on the science of relationships and the psychology of relationships, so you could learn what makes relationships work and what, are warning signs and red flags, wouldn't you take that course? Well, for 20 years, I've been teaching that course at Monmouth. And I know from all of my students who have taken that course, just how much they benefit from it, not just, educationally, but personally. I still get emails from students who took that course 10 years ago telling me, hey, Dr. L, something you taught me in that course, the science of blank, fill in that blank, has really helped me in my life. And so, this book is really an attempt to kind of spin out more broadly and help people more. And frankly, at one point I thought, does the world really need another relationship book? And the chances, maybe not, but this one I think is just very, very different. There's 350 plus references to science in there, but written in a way, I think, and presented in a way, I think, that's not going to bore you to tears. You're not going to even notice the science most of the time. And so, my whole goal in life is really to, use science to empower people to improve their lives. And so this book is a way to do that through relationships.
Yeah, I love that. I think the data points validate your premises, which again, isn't what people hear all the time. So that makes it extra powerful. And I have always said there's nothing in the world more important than relationships, which is why I write relationship books and why your book is so valuable. So I am so glad you wrote it. I like the knot in the shape of the heart on the cover. Is there any significance with that?
Yeah, I think relationships are hard. They're confusing, right? And sometimes, doubts creep in and we start to wonder about our relationship. And we don't know if this is a relationship we should hold on to or let go of. And so, FDR famously said, when you're at the end of your rope, tie a knot and hang on. And so this book is a way for people to learn more about relationships and tie more knots. And so it's not even just for people who are struggling in their relationship. So you might think, oh, I'm struggling. I need to tie knots so I can really hold on to my partner. But even if you're in a good relationship, the more knots your relationship rope has, the easier it is to hang on and make sure you're holding on to something that's really good.
I love that symbolism. And I'm thinking of tying the knot when you get married. The hope is, and I know you say this in the book, that this is not relationship rescue necessarily. You should be thinking and conscious of this from the very beginning of a long-term partnership, because the tools will serve you, and you don't need to be in crisis to read it, right?
Oh, absolutely. I often joke with my students and when I give talks about relationships that people will spend twice as much, 10 times as much time thinking about planning their wedding than they do about planning their relationship. And so, you really have to, we kind of take it for granted. It's something that's so simultaneously important to our lives, but yet we just kind of like cast it to fate and just kind of hope it works out. And like, I don't know. I just don't
Yeah.
think that's the path to success most times.
It's true. And we take for granted we're oftentimes kinder to strangers than our closest loved ones, which also doesn't make sense. So I think raising the level of consciousness, which this book does, is an important thing. And, I've written a lot about the difference between falling in love and being in love. And you delve into all this good stuff about what happens at the beginning of a relationship, how we, all the attention, all the excitement, and you lead this framework into a blind spot. So can you expand on that?
Yeah, we put so much emphasis early on in our relationships on the heart and not as much on the head, right? Because if you think about the first time you meet somebody, whether it's at a bar or online, the one thing you can know about another person when you know nothing about them at all is their appearance. And so that appearance starts to drive many of our impressions, right? We all like to play a little armchair psychologist and, kind of pick out features and try to read people. And in reality, we're pretty horrible at that. But now, because we're relying so much on our physical features, right, we're now letting passion and lust kind of drive the momentum of our relationship forward. And so butterflies, as I say in the book, they're overrated, right? I mean, it's a great feeling. Everybody loves the feeling of falling in love. But if you're expecting that to last for a long period of time, you're going to be disappointed because your body is designed to habituate. You're designed to adapt, right? And so you think if you've ever gone skydiving, you go skydiving, you're freaking out. The guy strapped to your back who's an instructor, he's been jumping out of planes his whole life. Like he's gotten used to it. And if you can get used to skydiving, the love you feel towards your partner, I mean, that's comparatively nothing. And so much of what we're looking at early in our relationship is sort of being overwhelmed and overrun by those passionate feelings of like, well, you might be a little bit of a jerk, but you're kind of hot. So I can overlook a lot of those things, which the problem is we have that all wrong. Because early in a relationship, we know from research that, if you track relationships over time, there's ones that are successful and ones that fail. If you look at them from the very, very beginning, both relationships are very rewarding early on, right? So what that's telling you, all relationships start off great, yet we give a lot of credit to our relationships that start out great. What we really need to focus on are the costs, because early on in relationships, there shouldn't be costs. And what we know from the divorce literature is that the problems that were there from the beginning, they don't go away.
100%. It's fun. Yeah, well, I totally agree with that. A lot of times people have said to me, he changed. He was totally, or she changed, totally different the first 6 months of dating. It's like, you were projecting then. You didn't know the person yet. And so, and romantic love, I often call it romantic love. We're a little crazy when we're falling with those butterflies, right? So,
Absolutely. And it's one of those
yeah,
things that we don't necessarily realize is that
yeah,
particularly Americans, we are extremely romantic. And what I mean by romantic is not necessarily, like rose petals and all that kind of stuff. It's like we put a lot of emphasis on love in relationships. Now we should, like love is important, but we almost put too much emphasis on it where it's like we can be in love and I can have those pitter patter kind of feelings, but we also need to be best friends. And so, I talk a lot and, I talk in the book about, your relationship partner has to pass that best friend test. They have to be somebody who you authentically like. And we know from the research from expert couples who have been married 15 plus years, you ask them, so what's the secret? How do you guys do it? Like, how do you have such this, thriving, vibrant relationship? And they say, number one, my partner's my best friend. Number two, I like my partner. Right. And it's like, it's really that simple sometimes, but early on, we kind of let some things about our partner that we don't like go by the wayside and just kind of put those blinders on because, things are going so well in other ways. So it's like you said, those 6 months, those things were there. You just weren't willing to see them.
that's right. That's absolutely true. So, what is relationship imposter syndrome? I know you write about that in the book, and what role does doubt play here?
Sure. So we're all probably familiar with imposter syndrome in everyday life. It's like where you're a smart, successful person, but you kind of have this like creeping fear that someday people are going to figure out how unintelligent you actually are, right? Or how unqualified for your job you actually are. And so I think the same thing can happen in relationships where your relationship is a lot better than you think, a lot stronger than you think, but doubt creeps in. You kind of worry, like, is this relationship really the best I can do? Is my relationship as good as it should be? Is my relationship as good as other people? And so what happens is these doubts start encouraging you to look for the negatives. And we already have a negativity bias. Like, if you get 10 pieces of good feedback and one piece of bad feedback, what's the thing that you focus on? You focus on that one bad comment that you receive, right? And so we have this tendency to, be hyper vigilant about negatives. And now this doubt feeds that monster, right? And so what we just need to realize is, and this is where I think, knowing the research is one of the most helpful things is being a relationship scientist in my own relationship is just kind of knowing all the good stuff helps me to not focus on the bad things, right? And I think, doubt can be such this like pernicious little thing that kind of wriggles in there and constantly makes you like wonder like, am I in a good relationship? And
Yeah.
then, you start looking for bad things. And we know from the research too that, when things are going well, right, in life and in your relationship, you actually seek out problems. Like you look for problems and you make small things into bigger problems. And that's,
Yeah.
that's not good for any relationship.
It's not. And, in life, like you're saying, we settle on a perspective and we collect evidence to support it. So if you think my partner's
Yes.
so lazy, but you didn't notice the 40 other things your partner did this week that were great, you will find evidence of it. So changing your perspective. Also, I know our brains, and you're a scientist, so you can validate this, but our brains are changing, right? The pathways we can actually influence our perspective can influence our thought patterns, and the more we practice looking at the good and not looking at the bad, it's training our brain, right, to look
Yeah. I
for
mean,
it
you
more.
want to create good habits of thought, right? I mean, you're nothing. It's like you said in your lovely intro, the ish, right? Nothing is 100%
No.
good and nothing is 100% bad. And so your partner is a mix of all good and bad things. And so if you choose to look for the bad, guess what? You're going to find them. But if you look for the good things, there's actually more of those and you're going to see more of those, right? And so part of this is just kind of like honing in your instrumentation a little bit and just being a little bit more observant and being willing to notice the good things. And so what I hope in a large part the book does is points out a bunch of good things that you didn't even know to look for, that you didn't even realize were going on. So you stop taking the good for granted.
That's great. I really appreciate it on that note of not, and perfect is overrated and it's not realistic. So I know you talk about debunking the idea that love should be effortless and perfect. And my Aunt Dorothy used to say, when I was younger and looking for perfection in dating, she'd say, if you start from perfect, you have nowhere to go. You have nowhere to grow together. So can you talk to us about your idea, and your quote is, the work makes it worth it. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think it's starting from a realization, which can be hard sometimes, but like you have to, you're not perfect, right? And so of course we always want to have like the best. And so what we call this in psychology, you know, some people have this maximizer mentality where they just want the absolute best in all things, right? You know, a B plus isn't good enough. It's got to be an A. A is not even good enough. I want an A plus. And so, you know, that seems like one of those good things, right? Like I should want the best. Don't I deserve the best? Why would I say I don't deserve the best? The problem is, you know, I call in the book the myth of maximization, is that it sounds good, but actually leads to more problems like depression and negative experiences. Because particularly in relationships, a maximizer says to themselves, I'm here until I find something better. And that's not how we look at relationships. We want to look at relationships as till death do us part, right? Until something better comes along. I mean, that's not, you know, a very committed, healthy relationship. And so, you know, does the work make it worth it? You know, think of all the time you spend together, right? And think, you know, again, if your partner's your best friend, you spend a lot of time together, kind of negotiating, compromising, you know, kind of working things out together. And that's helping you become more and more compatible. And so if you're willing to put that work in, it's going to be worth it, because every time you decide we're going to tackle this issue and solve this problem, it makes your relationship stronger. And that's ultimately what you want.
I totally agree with that. I love all the blind spots, and I know we don't have time for all of them, but you cover some great ones. So I'd love to do kind of a speed round. You don't have to
Okay.
answer fast, but just
Okay.
all the ones on my mind right now.
Sure.
So one of them is men and women are different. By the way, this was a great chapter because years ago I did a book tour with a male co-author, and they kept trying to have us battle each other. And it was like, we don't need to, it's not a male perspective or a female perspective. We're not that different all the time.
Right.
But best-selling books, men are from Mars, women are from Venus. And by the way, The Rules is still a bestseller, which is some of the worst relationship advice I've read. So let's talk about why believing men and women are different in relationships is problematic.
Yeah, I mean, and I think, you know, it's not surprising, you know, what you're saying, you know, people trying to pit men against women. It's low-hanging fruit because it's something that we all kind of believe, but when we study it, it's fundamentally untrue. And I'm going to say that again. Men and women are more similar by a large stretch than they are different. Can we find differences? Absolutely, they exist. But if we look for those similarities, those are there too. Now, the problem with it, I mean, a lot of times people say, oh, well, yeah, I believe that. I don't care. It's harmless. It's not harmless though, because what you're doing is you're setting up what I call the tyranny of low expectations. Now, if you're with a guy and you use he's a stereotypical guy who's not good with his emotions, he doesn't like to talk, he's a little bad at relationships, and you're finding yourself in this suboptimal, not great relationship, but you're with a guy and you believe all guys are like this, well, why would you end this not so great relationship with this not so great guy? Because the next guy is going to be just like this guy. Like all guys are the same. So now you're finding yourself stuck because why would I bother? You know, your guy partner who is not very nice to you and takes all the power and says, babe, I'm just like this. This is how guys are. And you're like, yeah, I guess guys are, you know, now you're not setting up, you're missing out on all this opportunity to grow and improve.
Yeah, I like that idea of low hanging fruit. And I think many relationship popular theories are the low hanging fruit. They work in little bites, you know, in media, but the research doesn't back the claims as
right. They're often wrong.
Totally wrong.
Easy, but wrong.
And I wrote a whole book debunking dating rules for that reason. And your whole book is debunking a lot of commonly held beliefs. So we've talked a little bit about love not being enough and you should deeply like your partner. I think I used to teach this course called Real Love, REEL, and we'd look at movie clips and I'd say, see, this is dysfunctional, codependent, and unhealthy. That clip is really not what you want to model. And the best relationship movie would be really boring to watch, actually, most of it. not all of it.
Uh-huh.
So, so many epic romantic movies that we're trying to capture in our own relationships. This is probably a blind spot. So what do we have wrong here?
Yeah, I mean, it's literally exactly what you said, right? It's like in movies and television, relationships, they're high drama, right? It's all this high energy and there's conflict, and when they argue with each other, it's all this turmoil, right? Now, a really good relationship, they'll disagree, but it's not going to be high energy. It's going to be, when you said that the other day, I really wish, it made me feel, it's so calm, it's so boring, it's so neutral. It's like what we see on TV are what we call in science the outliers, right? It's these people who are just, it's not normal. And that's what makes it interesting. But you have to realize it's there and it's interesting, but because it's on TV, it doesn't mean that it's normal and common. And that's where a lot of people, get into trouble with these things.
And
Some
it's
of the
the
good
thing with
relations.
reality TV, right? Because reality TV, they're casting people with high drama, big personalities who thrive on that. That's not what we
Yeah.
should be emulating.
Yeah, because the easygoing, calm, rational, normal person is like, what are they going to do? Like, you're just waiting for them to do things, and then they're not, right? It's like, look at some of the few good relationships on TV, and they're so few. Jim and Pam on The Office, for the most part, are pretty darn good, right? And it's an older show, but Friday Night Lights, I tell people, it's a show about football, but I tell my students all the time, like, watch this show, just the first season, even just the first 3 episodes. Coach Taylor and his wife are literally the best relationship I have ever seen on television. And it shows them happy together. It shows them arguing. It shows them working things out, but they work it out. They talk it out, right?
Yeah,
That's
I
what we want.
actually once wrote an article about Family Guy. Peter Griffin and Lois, I claimed had one of the best relationships on TV. They're cartoons,
I could
of
see that.
course, right?
Sure.
Because
Sure.
they do disagree and they call each other out and they communicate in a very direct way, which is the most healthy. They're not passive aggressive. They're not
Right.
passive.
Yep.
And then they work it out, and there's this really nice, end usually where they find connection through the challenge. And so I like your examples too. I think it's great to bring those up and kind of get people's juices flowing about what fighting is okay as long as you fight fairly. Fighting is actually good, right? So,
if you look at the tools in your toolbox to make your relationship better, communication is the number. I mean, that's probably the number one thing, right? And so if you're not willing to have an argument, you're basically saying I'm not willing to communicate, because 2 adults who are in equal power in a relationship, as you should be, should have disagreements. You're not clones of each other. So you're not going to always agree about every last little thing in your relationship. And so if you're not fighting, arguing, right? If you're not like embracing those conflict points, you're never going to solve anything. And so what happens is those things just kind of build up, and they build up over time until one day it's just socks on the floor and it blows up, right? And now you have this huge big fight about socks on the floor, which is completely ridiculous, but they got there because you let it get there.
yes, it's interesting. I think if you interview couples who you say, recount your last 5 fights, sometimes they don't even know what it was
Right.
about. And we recycle fights, we know that, but sometimes they're so insignificant. I love the blind spot in the book. If you love me, you change. Because one of my big relation principles, which I actually did in my own TEDx talk here, was people want to be challenged, not changed. People do not want to be changed. It's one of my principles. So what research do you have behind that blind spot? If you really love me, you change.
Yeah, I mean, people want to try to change their partner, and there's this myth that that's just kind of part of the deal. It's like, you're going to be my fixer-upper partner, and so I'm going to turn you into partner 2.0, and it's fundamentally unfair, because if someone basically said to you, "I love you, but I'd love you a lot more if you were different," I mean, like, what? That's completely the opposite of what you're supposed to want in a relationship. And so we know that people who, and here's you might want to change your partner, and you might be thrilled that your partner is willing to change. Now, the problem with that is a partner who's so willing to change probably doesn't have a high level of self-understanding or self-concept clarity. They don't really know themselves that well. Now, you might be thrilled that they're changing, but the problem is not really being so sure of who you are comes with this whole constellation of other problems. And so that like overly pliable partner seems like a win, but it's a net loss for sure. The other thing is people are not really very good at the tactics they use when they're trying to change their partner. And so, there's going to be nagging, harassing, name calling, right? It's usually not, there's not a bunch of people that are behavior analysts that know how to shape behavior in other people necessarily. And so a lot of times what you're going to try to do to change your partner is not so nice. What we also know from the research is even if you do use really nice tactics where you're kind and you reward all the good behavior and you kind of ignore the bad behavior, what we know is your partner catches on to this and it feels manipulative. It feels inauthentic and not genuine, where it's like it's conditional love, which if you think about why you're with your partner, you're supposed to be with each other because you love each other unconditionally, because I love you for who you actually are, not for who I want you to be.
That's true. And your partner can feel it when you are trying to change your partner. It's not a good feeling on the receiving end, that he or she
Right.
isn't good enough, that he or she, you don't value what he or she's bringing to the table. That's a really hard thing to feel. And many people have stayed in those relationships where they did everything to be someone else to satisfy a partner, instead of saying, I often say, stop looking at who he is, look at who you are with him when you're dating, because that'll tell you everything you need to know. Because how you're showing up is where you can see how healthy your relationship is, right?
Yeah.
So,
And it's like you can help your partner change, but it's not you. You're not the one that's kind of driving the action, right? If your partner wants to change, your job is to support, right? Be like the world's best personal assistant, like coach, cheerleader, all those things. They get to pick the direction of their path. It's their journey. You're there to help them on their path and their journey. You don't get to pick the direction that they go. That's not fair.
I love that. So the blind spot, it's wrong to be selfish in a relationship. I really like that one. I'd love you to talk about that one.
Sure. This goes back to, one of the basic premises that we believe about relationships that's untrue is people think that I have to sacrifice myself for my partner, right? And so we kind of set up this giving tree mentality where it's like, my job is to just give to my partner. But the problem is, if you're familiar with the giving tree, is like by the end, you're a rotted out stump. There's nothing of you left. And so you have to, there's compromise, right? So you have to make some sacrifices. But what we know in the research about sacrifice is when people sacrifice, it makes them more committed, right? But it doesn't make them any happier. But it's only helpful, right, on days when you're not that stressed out. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't have very many of those days. And so, all that sacrifice that you're putting forth ultimately isn't all that helpful. And one of the other reasons is our partner misses about 50% of the things that we do for them. And so you're doing all this sacrificing, your partner is missing half of it. That's a recipe for resentment, right? It creates a lot of potential problems. And so, it's much better to think of your relationship as like, I have to take care of myself and you, right? It's not either or. And too often it's like, I'm here for you. And then you kind of ignore yourself because it's like, that's what I need to do. But it's like, I take care of myself and then you. And so if we're both doing that, we also know from research that, if I go out and just do a hobby or, pursue some interest all on my own, there's spillover back into my relationship. It's not purely selfish. Just because I want to go windsurfing and you have no interest in doing that, and I'm spending 3 hours alone by myself doing that, there's still ways for that to benefit our relationship. I bring those experiences back and you get to benefit as my partner. I mean, that's exactly
I think
what
it
you want.
definitely makes relationships more exciting when your partner has an active life outside the relationship. None of us would have wanted to marry someone who had no life outside of the relationship. right? So
It's one of the things that made the pandemic so hard, right? Like you and your partner are living in this own little bubble, and it's like, what'd you do today? Well, you saw everything I did today, right? We lived in the same 20 by 20 square. Like,
I
you know,
know.
of
I
course we
keep
know.
saying, like, when the question used to be asked, who would you want to be on a desert island with? We didn't think it would actually happen, which it did this year. But you could really love and like your partner, and it's a lot of your partner. But yeah, I think, you know, being selfish, there's a lot of, that's a loaded way of even saying it. It's really like, it's really healthy to be a full person. I no offense to Plato, who I'm about to like criticize here, but I don't think two halves become a whole. I think two wholes become a better relationship. And so
you have twice as much stuff then.
Yeah, it's creating a better, a deeper connection when you know who you are and you're living a life that's authentic and fulfilling.
Sure.
What key pieces, you know, I've asked you specific blind spots, but if you had to, one of my favorite questions, which media often asks, is like, you have 30 seconds, what's a relationship? Which, I mean, you wrote 300 pages on this, but what are some key pieces of advice you'd give to couples who are listening, or people who are listening, or like, I'm actually at the point where I'm trying to make it work. It's not just so I raise the level of consciousness. I'm confused and I need some tools. What advice do you have?
I think, you know, one of the things we talked about is communication. And so one of the things I think people really have to take to heart in communication in relationships is that it's not you against your partner, right? Because if it's you against your partner and communication becomes about winning, too often we focus on winning. And so the problem is, if you win, guess who loses, right? Instead, you have to think it's not me against you, it's us against the problem. And so that problem is something neither of us want. It's something we both want to solve. And we have to shift our perspective in that way. So that's one. Another one, you know, we just talking about sacrifice. I think sacrifice is important. I'm not saying don't sacrifice, but I think you have to be careful about overdoing it. You don't want to become a martyr, and you want your sacrifices to be minor and mutual. Like they should be like these little things that, you know, you shouldn't have to be sacrificing a big chunk of your identity. Right? I love what you said earlier about, you know, we want whole people. Right? Don't you want to be in love with a whole person? Don't you want your best friend, romantic partner to be a whole person, not faking half just to somehow appease you? I mean, that's nothing that anybody should want. And I think the last one is something I said before, but it's worth reiterating, is this idea is like, your partner should be your best friend. Right? And that sounds obvious, and everyone's like, oh yeah, of course my partner is my best friend. But think of what you ask of your best friend. I almost want to say demand, but it's not really a demand, but it's just like your level of expectation for your best friend is pretty high. Like your best friend can't get away with with being mean to you. You'd call them out on it. If they were rude to you, if they didn't ever help you, if they were never there, like you just wouldn't tolerate that from a best friend. And yet too often, you know, this goes back to, you know, putting passionate love too high on our priority list. We let those things go because I'm in love. But like love is respect, it's kindness, it's liking each other as people, it's enjoying your time together. That's love as well. And so, you know, that best friendness of our relationship is really, really important.
Totally agree. How about, you know, one of your millions of view talk about breakups? How about maybe some people have tuned in because they watched that and they want to hear more on that. And I know
Sure.
you talk about breakups won't leave you broken. So maybe we can, before we open this up to the audience to ask questions or dialogue with us, gritting versus quitting, talk to us about that.
Sure. So this is something I discovered in writing the book that I wish I would have known about for my talk, because this absolutely would have been in there. So people are likely familiar with the idea of grit, right? It's that perseverance, that tough it out attitude, Angela Duckworth's work. And a lot of times we think grit is good, right? I mean, that's the way to get things done. And, you know, maybe it is around the office, but in your relationship, maybe not so much, right? And so there's some really interesting studies. One was they brought people to a lab. It was like a casino, but it was actually like a research lab. And they had people play roulette. And ahead of time, they said, you know, how much money are you going to lose? Like, what's your cap? And everyone would give kind of their limit. And then they would let them play. And what they found was the people who were grittier, those persevering people, lost more money because they just kept throwing money in. There's like, they were like way too optimistic, right? And so, I mean, that there's some lessons in there for sure, right? You can just kind of see how that applies to relationships. Another study very much related to this that I just love. They had people come in and they had them do this terrible task. It was, you're sitting there for 25 minutes and it's like every so often you had to press a button. I mean, and this is like mind-numbingly boring. There's nothing interesting about this at all. And so, 20 minutes in, they have 5 minutes to go and they say, hey, look, you have 5 minutes to go. You can quit now. And so this is a no-brainer. Every single person should quit because there's absolutely no good reason, right, to see this through. Like there's no good reason to play out this last 5 minutes. But now some people, grittiness could be bad here, right? Now, so if people thought the task was really trying to see how much they're willing to stick to it, grit was a bad thing because those people played out those last 5 minutes. But if people thought it wasn't about grit, it was more about, can I make a good decision here? They quit. Now, we think of quitting and it has this bad connotation, but if you're in a bad relationship, quitting is absolutely what you need to do, right? And you just think of how much of our relationship folklore and things revolves around like, how long have you been together? How many anniversaries do you have? Like we put so much time, so much emphasis on time and how long people have been together. And really, we should start worrying a lot more about quality and much less about quantity. It's not the number of months. It's the number of good moments and number of good qualities that your relationship has. And so I think, that's kind of that double-edged sword of grit where it can actually encourage you to keep trying, keep working, keep at it. But it's like at some point, quitting is the right decision. Like if that's the good decision is to quit sometimes because, if your current relationship doesn't help you make a better person, the next one will, right? And so, and I say in the TED Talk, great relationships seldom fail, but the bad ones do as they should. And sometimes you just have to let go of one to find one that's better.
100%. And, in my book, He's Just Not Your Type, and That's a Good Thing, I ended the book with date someone you would want to be with if nobody else was looking. And I think so much of your book, because that's really, nobody really is looking. You're in a relationship when it's not that sexy a lot of the time.
Sure.
So in closing, just superficially how we see love and how we gauge a good partner. What are some key other qualities maybe we haven't gotten to that you think we should all be looking for if people are tuning in who are looking for love? What kind of things should people be looking for if it's not just that physical attraction?
I think this is an easy one. You want to look for someone who makes you a better person, right? You want to look for someone who helps you grow, helps you change. Like you said about challenge, like we should want our partner to push us to become better people, right? And that's not something that you can see across a room or on a dating profile. It's only something that can be revealed through conversation and time spent together. And that's, you want to talk about the things that make it work, right? If you want to be in a relationship, 15, 50 years, you got to look for your counterpart in the world, right? Who's your other person in the universe that's going to help balance you out, push you, stretch you, change you, challenge you, and ultimately improve you.
Yeah, totally agree. Maybe we can open this now. I'm sure some people in the audience, I have a bunch more questions I'm happy to ask as well, because there's so many interesting studies in your book, but maybe we can open it up if anyone else has thoughts or questions.
Hi, it's Brian, and we've had very few questions from the audience, so we welcome folks to set questions in the chat or raise your hand and we'll unmute you. But I'm going to ask you guys about a couple of ultimates that we haven't talked about. We lost a lot of people this year, and the ultimate breakup is death and illness. And so, Gary, I don't know if you talk about that in your book, and I'm going to ask you about birth and the effect of birth in a minute, Andrea. So those two endpoints in life, Gary, what are your thoughts about death and illness as they impact relationships? And what can we learn? What can we do better?
There's a lot there. It's like you said, it's kind of the ultimate breakup in a lot of ways. And hopefully, a lot of times it's experienced after we've been with somebody for not just months, but years and decades, right? And so we built up a long history with those folks. And it's something that can be very hard and challenging. And what we know from research, particularly with men and women, is, husbands, when their wives pass on, they tend to pass on pretty quickly thereafter. And so part of it, and women don't necessarily have the same exact experience, right? They don't necessarily die as quickly as the men do. But part of the reason for that is you have your romantic relationship, and women are better than men generally at having other relationships outside. And so we talk a lot about romantic relationships, but what we really should talk about is relationships just as a broader, bowl, right? Like, have more friendships. Relationships are the most important thing in our world, and it's not just your romantic relationship. And so some of that research on, how spouses deal with death really helps emphasize the importance of having multiple relationships with multiple different kinds of people.
That's great. And let's treat something more joyful, but also a triangle. When you have your first child, all of a sudden there's this new being that's interrupting the relationship that is now getting lots and lots of attention, as that child should. But, it becomes a love triangle as soon as you have a child. Andrea and Gary, do you want to talk about some best ideas around having your first child?
Sure. Well, I wrote a book, Cheat on Your Husband with Your Husband, and that was really designed that was also for parents. I wasn't a parent at that time when I did the research, but the research still remains, which is that it's really important to connect as lovers and partners, not just as parents and roommates in a relationship. And I think especially during COVID and quarantine, pandemic life didn't allow for much romance, let's be honest. That said, there are still moments. Ish is really about not thinking in terms of all or nothing. Because when we think in terms of all or nothing, we end up with nothing because we can't do it all. So kind of thinking in an ish way about romance and connection when you have a baby and during a pandemic, for instance, thinking like, what small thing can I do to connect with my partner in a way where we're not in this moment parents? And it might be, research has shown like new experiences that you do with a couple in a couple really adds some kind of zest and experience, just novelty. So it might be cooking together a new recipe, picking a part of the world you can't travel to now because COVID, but working, on the recipe together and getting kind of excited about your little date and maybe listening to music from the region. There are ways you can have ish moments of romance when you can't have a 2-week vacation to Hawaii with your lover. So just not thinking in terms of all or nothing is my biggest tip for new parents.
Gary, a word from you on the first child or on kids in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you asked for the good things, but I think, one of the mistakes that people make is trying to have a kid to save a bad relationship, right? That's like pouring gas on a fire, right? And so to be a good parent, you have to first be a good husband and wife. Like, you have to be, a good couple. And so by being a good couple, you can be a good parent.
So let's talk about other things that can sort of invade a great relationship, which would be disparate beliefs, whether it's spiritual beliefs or dietary practices or finance, or God forbid, a red and a blue couple who have different political persuasions. How do you accommodate for those divergent beliefs and creeds and so on in a relationship that's otherwise strong?
Yeah, I think, it's what I said before about your relationship toolbox, and it's communication, right? You have to talk those things out. And we know the number one taboo topic in relationships is the relationship itself. And so a lot of times we don't like to talk about those possible areas of friction and dissimilarity because nobody likes conflict. So we try to avoid conflict by avoiding some of those topics. But what I think people would find if they actually were willing to dive into some of those topics, like you kind of take like that red and blue example, those two people, they both like politics, and there's probably a lot of other things that they have in common in terms of their beliefs. And then you can actually learn something about the other side and see it as one of those chances for novelty and challenge that we were just talking about. So, communication is key as always.
Okay, so let's go to the data. What is the data saying about relationship trends here in the 2020s? I have a favorite saying, which was that we usually celebrate the new decade with all kinds of exciting predictions, but because of COVID, we forgot to do that. So here it is, early 2021. We need to celebrate this blank slate, this broad canvas called the 2020s in front of us. But what's the data saying about relationship trends in the 2020s, or about ish trends in the 2020s, or about couples having babies?
I'll tell you a few, and then I'd love to hear. I'd love to broaden that to Dr. L. I like that your students call you that. So we've seen in the fertility treatment world, because I run Pregnantish, of course, fertility treatment skyrocketed this year. Now, I was interviewed by a lot of media. Why is that happening? It's harder to undergo medical treatments and do this during a pandemic. But I think you could not escape this year without looking at your life. For many people, you have existential moments this year. What's most important? And if there's no greater value for a lot of people than family, than relationships. So it's not surprising to me. Egg freezing went up a lot. Fertility treatment, even telehealth appointments went up a lot. I think overall fertility rates decline in terms of actual babies born, but the research does show that people were speeding up that goal who maybe had been thinking about it. So that's one thing I can share.
Yeah, it is true that the journal reported just today that birth rates are at an historic low in the United States. So it's an interesting anomaly, that paradox.
Yes.
Yeah, I would just kind of, piggyback on that a little bit to say that, before the pandemic happened, right, you sort of go back to last March, and people had two big predictions. There was going to be a baby boom and there was going to be a lot of divorce. And neither of those things were true. And it just goes to show how wrong we can be about relationships, right? We make a lot of predictions and a lot of it's based on stereotypes and, a lot of things that are wrong that we don't know is wrong. And we're just trying to do our best to make those predictions. But what we found in the data from, this pandemic time period is relationships were doing pretty good, right? A lot of what we found, Monmouth did a couple of polls and people are reporting that they're quite satisfied in their relationship. The pandemic didn't ruin people. And if you really think about it, there's no reason why it should have, right? You're spending more time with who ostensibly is one of your favorite, if not your favorite number one person in the entire world. So why should that be a bad thing? And, and I think kind of going forward after this, kind of looking forward trends, I think, we could be entering in a golden age of relationships where I think this last year, as Andrea just kind of said, is like, we've reflected a little bit. We had this kind of like existential moment. It's like, if people haven't realized how important relationships and not just superficial, like close, meaningful relationships are, if they never realized it before, these last 14 months have made it abundantly clear. And so I think going forward, people are going to value those long-term, solid, steady, best friend kinds of relationships much more than they have in the past.
Yes, and our family relationships. I mean, we're all so excited to give hugs again and do those simple things that we took for granted our whole lives. And this is only a good thing, because we shouldn't take it for granted to hug our parent, for instance, because we don't know how long we'll have those moments. So this has allowed us to really not take for granted the closest people to us. And that's a beautiful thing. We should always have that perspective.
So we have to close it up in a minute. And I want to ask you guys how the audience could learn more. I mean, of course, they could buy Gary's book and your books, Andrea. But okay, just starting with relationships, is there a course? Is there a workbook? Is there a workshop? Is there adult education at Monmouth University? Is there a way for the audience to get experiential besides reading Stronger Than You Think?
For me, I write a blog for Psychology Today, Psychology of Relationships, where, at 2-3 times a month, I'm putting out an article, and it's all the same kinds of things that you would find in the book for free.
Okay.
Some of it overlaps, some of it doesn't, but it's all, common relationship questions written in an engaging way that's based in science.
Okay, so Psychology Today, Gary's column. And how about you, Andrea? How about Pregnantish? What can we learn there?
Well, we have content. We have great content every day, but I would say the Pregnantish podcast is a great place to start. I interview people who have the most unexpected, stranger than fiction, inspiring paths to parenthood, but we also tackle seemingly taboo topics like how to keep sex sexy when you're not easily conceiving, and how to keep relationships intact, which are rocked during hard chapters in life.
Yeah.
And you don't need to be going through infertility. It's really, we talk a lot about grief and relationships and family and relationships. So the Pregnish podcast, I think, is a great thing to check out on my end.
Great. So and all of us know folks that are trying to get pregnant, and Pregnancies is a great resource, growing. And another resource is come on back to TEDx Asbury Park in the fall of 2022, because both Gary and Andrea will join us with fresh talks. Who knows what ideas they're going to have exactly a year from now. We were going to have the TED conference this Saturday, but it's been moved out a year to May 7th, 2022 at the Two River Theater in Red Bank. Thank you both so much. This will be a recorded interview. We'll share it and put it out there on the social media. A few announcements real quick, aside from thanking you both so much for being here with us tonight. TEDx Asbury Park produces play readings next Thursday at 7 o'clock. Everyone that attended will get an invite. This is our second, actually it's our third round of play readings, and it's our second round of original plays. And so we hope you'll join us. The series is called One Act, One Idea, where we produce short plays that express a big idea. So that's it. We're gonna take a break here and let the audience go. And thank you all so much. And we'll see you maybe next Thursday on the 13th. And then we'll see you in the fall when we start to open up ticket sales for TEDx Asbury Park and our events at Two River Theater. Thanks a lot. And thank you, Andrea and Gary, for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.